Let's continue now with our discussion about Rava, which we began yesterday. And you may recall that Rava in Menachos Daf Chav Gimel was vacillating about a case where after he adds the shemen to the mincha, he squeezes out the shemen and it gets burnt on the mizbeach. And Rava doesn't know exactly whether or not such a mincha is kshera because he now has done a separate haktorah on the shemen and a separate subsequent haktorah on the mincha. And we suggested in the name of Rashi that the suffix is, can you be makdir on the eitzim, on the fire, and the shemen now will somehow be choser u'mischaber lakomets. So again, I'm not sure exactly, as I mentioned yesterday, what the mitzius is, but somehow, if at time T1 he squeezes the oil onto the eitzim, and then time T2, immediately afterwards, he places the remainder of the balance of the soles with whatever shemen is left onto the eitzim, there's a chibur in one side in Rava's suffix, a connection now, an integration in which the shemen that he squeezed out, so to speak, goes back into the mincha. Or ein ze nechshav kechibur. Now, if eino nechshav kechibur, then the mincha itself, when he does the kmitza, it is lacking shemen, and therefore it's possible. That's what we got up to today. Tosfos offers another pshat. He says, "Im nechsar mishemen hakometz li'achar kmitzoso, ein hakometz nifsal." He says that once you do the kmitza, that's it. You're safe. You've reached home plate. The removal of the shemen after kmitza could not undermine the kashrus of the mincha because you already did the kmitza. You don't undo the kmitza as a result of this mitzuri of removing the shemen. Rav has a different stuff. Says Tosfos, Ha'im tzorach lahaktir es ha'etzim yachad im hakometz mishum hashemen habalua bahem. What's confusing Rava is the fact that after he squeezes the shemen out of the mincha, the shemen now becomes balua. It's absorbed by the eitzim. And the question now is, does that shemen inside the eitzim require haktorah? Which would mean, according to one side in Rava, shetzarach lahaktir es ha'eitzim yachad im hakometz mishum she ha'eitzim balu es hashemen. The shemen is balu in the eitzim, and now he needs haktorah of the shemen together with the kometz, and that means he's going to have to burn the eitzim themselves. O Dilma, the second side in Rava, liacha shenivla be'eitzim, ein tzarich laktira. he doesn't have to be maktir the eitzim together with the komets, because once it's nivla, once it's been absorbed by the eitzim, it is no longer connected to this komets. It's a separate entity. So that Tosfos disagrees with Rashi on two counts. First of all, Rashi's assuming that you need to get the shemen back into the komets for the Haktorah. And therefore Rashi says that Rava vacillates as to whether or not there is chibur here, which would generate a halach of choser, in which the shemen is choser into the komets. Tosfos doesn't accept such a thing, because Tosfos rejects it on the grounds that once he had the komets, if he removes the shemen after the kmitza, it doesn't retroactively undermine the kashrus of the kmitza. But now we have a second machlokas. Tosfos is insisting that there's halacha here of blia, that the shemen might, on one side of Rava L'chumra, might be still considered an entity that requires haktorah. Why? Because it is balua in the eitzim. It's not completely gone. And therefore, tzarich lahaktir es ha'eitzim sheyesh men blias shemen yachad im hakomets. Because if the shemen is still a viable entity, not in and of itself, in other words, we can't identify it, but nevertheless it's a viable entity in its state of blia, then by burning the eitzim together with the komets, I now have haktorah on komets plus shemen, and that's what I require. Now, at this point, he introduces another issue entirely, which is called ribui v'chisaron alavona. Until now, we've been talking about the shear of the komets itself and the shirayim. Now we're shifting our emphasis to the lavona. Lavona also requires haktorah. So that now, in addition to the kmitza of the soles, you need a kmitza of the lavona. What's the shear of lavona? Who komets echad. Now, again, I can't tell you in exact volume how much is a komets of lavona. We'll call it X. It's undefined. So what happens in the following scenario? B'shas hakmitza lo haya shir zeh. There was no komets worth, whatever that volume is, of lavona at the time of the kmitza. The mincha is therefore psula, because mincha without lavona, where the Torah requires lavona, is an invalid mincha. However, what happens in a case where he already did the kmitza on the lavona, and then it was chaser, then he's missing part of the lavona? He says, according to Rabbi Meir, since after the kmitza, before the haktorah, he's missing part of the lavona, is kevan shelo hiktir kol shiura, he wasn't able now to be marked to the entire shir of the lavona. Amincha psula. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, we only need the shir of a komets at the time of the kmitza. If after the kmitza, the shir of lavona was chaser, and therefore when he gets up to the haktorah, Afin notza rak shir shnei kurtim kshera. So he doesn't have a full kometz's worth of the levona of haktorah. Or needs is the barest minimum, which is shnei kurtim. Then we have a third sheet of Reb Shimon. Daishe yishar mimenu b'shas haktorah kurt echad. The barest minimum, one kurt. And that's the Mishnah in Menachos, a three-way machlokas. The Gemara now quotes Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says that there are two categories of levona. There's a levona that accompanies a mincha, and then there's a levona that comes bifnei atzma on its own. And there's a conceptual difference between the two. Says Rabbi Yochanan, the whole issue about nechsera halavona mishir hakometz is only with regard to a levona abba im ha mincha. But levona abba b'fnei atzma, let's say, for example, a person takes upon himself a pledge, arei alai levona, and now we're going to take levona, frankincense, and we're going to be makriv on the mizbech alone, then L'divrei hakol eino kshera b'pachos mikometz. His pledge obligates him to be maktir a kometz of levona, and no one would debate that unless he has a haktar of a full kometz of levona. He has not fulfilled his pledge. Now, where else do we find an example of haktaras levona, in addition to the case of a person who takes upon himself a pledge, harei alai levona? In the case of the bazichin that accompany the lechem upon it, says Rabbi Yochanan, v'chein shnei bazichei levona haboyim im lechem upon sheichasru mishir shnei kmatzim, meaning you need kedei kmitza for each one of the bazichin, l'divrei hakol psulim, because that levona of the lechem apanim is considered ba b'fnei atzma, and if it's ba b'fnei atzma, we must have a shear of kometz in the haktorah. Who disagrees with Rabbi Yochanan? It's Rav Dimi, Rav Avi, and Rav Yitzchak Nafka. According to the dissenting opinion, Kishem shenechlaku b'levona haba mincha kach nechlaku gam b'levona haba b'fnei atzma. We are so convinced by the intuitive logic of Rabbi Yochanan, it's very hard to believe that anyone would disagree with Rabbi Yochanan. You have a levona ba b'fnei atzma, and the essence of the mitzvah of levona as a separate karman is the aktara, and you don't have a shear of kometz. But again, it comes back to the other the principle that we operated with, that the shear of levona, like the shear of a mincha, is in the kometz. What I mean is in the kmitza. And once he had the shear at the time of the kmitza, that's irreversible. Now, what happens in a case of ribui shear levona? If you remember yesterday, we discussed ribui shear in the mincha and ribui shear in shemen. But what about ribui shear in levona? So the Gemara on Daf Yud Aleph says something very vague, almost ambiguous. The Gemara says, Pa'amim shamincha kshera, pa'amim shi psula. What does that mean? So we can understand this Gemara based on a Rambam who says that im nosan shnei kmatzin psula, if he doubled the kometz then the entire mincha is disqualified. And again, we're talking about doubling the komets of the levona. However, if he exceeds beyond the komets, but he doesn't reach the level of shnei kmatzim, it's somewhere in the middle, we'll call it 1.5, then ksheira. That's what the Mishnah had in mind, or I should say the Brisa had in mind when it said pa'amim ksheira. That's how the Rambam understands it. Rashi, however, and Tosfos offer another pshat. Just the opposite. Im nosan shnei kmatzim, if he doubled it, instead of one kometz, he gave two kmatzim, ksheira. Why? Shekain kol echad mehem b'fnei atzmo roy linosen b'mincha. Each one is suitable for Haktarah. If he adds and exceeds beyond the shear of Kedei Kmitza, of a komet, then it depends. Is he adding something that could be brought on the Mizbeach? It's kosher, and therefore it doesn't undermine the kashrus of the mincha. But if he adds something, the addition from 1 to 1.5, half of a komet, could not be brought on the Mizbeach, then it undermines and disqualifies the mincha. Unbelievable machlokas here between the Rambam on the one side, Rashi and Tosfos on the other. Min hakotz el hakotz. Nosad b'mincha shnei komtzei levona. Let's assume, according to Rashi and Tosfos, that if he adds an extra kometz, a full kometz of levona, the mincha is kshera. But avad echad min. Now, one kometz went the way of all flesh. It just rose up to Shemayim. It doesn't exist anymore. Im kodem kmita avad hamincha kshera. Everything is fine because he still has one kometz, and that's all he needs. Until he does the kmitza, all he needs is one kometz. The second kometz, whichever one it is, it doesn't matter, they got lost, is irrelevant. It was never given a designation for the Mizbeach. So now you can wonder whether or not the extra kometz is worth of levona, according to the sheet of Rashi and Tosfos, now becomes integrated into the kmitza, and now you require haktarah on the entire volume of 2 kmatzim, even though it's double the shear of levona. Im avad li'achar kmitza, the kmitza was kovea that both of these kedei kmitzas volume are part of the mincha, is then avad ha-mincha psula. Shekena kmitza kovas osam, in the plural, likarev yachad. Fascinating. You've got a volume of a kometz that's not really required. On the contrary, according to the Rambam Shita, it undermines the carbon. But we're going according to Tosfos that since it's royally carbon atzmo, therefore it doesn't passel the carbon. Now we're going a step further. It might indeed passel the carbon. Why? Because if you add the extra kometz's worth at the time of the kmitza, it becomes integrated into the mincha, such that now if it gets lost, there's no aktara on the entire mincha, and therefore it's psula. Shakmitza kovaso som likarev yachad. The shuv einam yichom likarev bazeh achar zeh. Now, according to the Rambam, if avad echabem kodem akmitza kshera, mishum shebeshas akmitza lo hayaba ribui levona. Right, we said that according to the Rambam Shita, if you have an extra kometz's worth, then it passes the carbon. However, if it's avad kodem akmitza, then we say that there was not a ribui at the time of the kmitza, and it's kosher. Now let's apply the same logic to the case of the bazichin of Levona that accompany the lechem upon. Shnei baziche Levona shall lechem upon shenitnu bahem arba komtse Levona bimkom shnayim. Right, we should have one kometz Levona for each one of the two bazichin, and instead he doubled it, so he now has two komtzei levona for each one of the bazichin. All told, he's got four komtzei levona. Im avdu shnai mehem kodem. Now, what's the kodem over here? We're not dealing with kmitza, but it's kolem siluk halechem me'ashulchan. The parallel to kmitza in the case of bezichin is the siluk lechem min hashulchan. So if at the time of siluk lechem min hashulchan he only has two kmatzim and the other two went the way of all flesh, then everything's kosher. But in avdu li'achar siluk halechem min hashulchan, then psul. Just 1 second. Not sure what I just said is correct. Let me. Okay, that's what I think is. Again, I'm a little bit unsure myself, but I think that's what he means. All right, let's see if we can chaparayin another paragraph. What happens if the thinking about it one more time. All right. What happens now in a case where the kometz itself gets lost? Right? The kometz requires haktara on the mizbeach. And is there a moment in time when the kometz locks in its status and its kashrus, such that even if it gets lost after that moment in time, the mincha is kshera? And this is the sugya of hispazer hakometz. In other words, the kometz got spread and it fell on the floor of the azara. Now, if the kometz reached a certain moment in time, as I said, it's locked in, and then it falls onto the ritzvas hazara, I can collect it again, because that kometz, or that part of the kometz that's on the ground, has already been established as a kometz. And if it falls on the ground, I just have to gather it together and be maktir. What is that critical moment that generates, shall we call it a chal shem kometz, such that if it falls, I can now just simply collect it? That's called nesina b'kli. You may remember that after he does the kmitza in the first kli, then he puts the kometz into a second kli. That second kli through the nesina engenders the kedusha of the kometz in such a way that now it doesn't lose its status if it falls on the ritzvah. So therefore, is pazer hakometz ala ritzvah li achar shenitam bekli osvo umaktiro. He takes a shovel and he gathers it together and he's maktir. Avol, but if his pazer kodem shenitam bekli, so it doesn't have that state in which the chal Hashem was engendered into the kometz, possible. Shekain sorech hakometz li nosen bekli miyad hakohen v'lo mimokam acher. In order for a kmitza to be a valid kmitza kshera, the kohen has to place it in the kli, but it's got to go directly in the kli, not through another stage, meaning not through the asifa of the kometz from the ground, the ritzvah sazor, and then place the kometz into the kli. It's got to go from the first kli into the second kli, miyad hakohen, v'lo mimokam acher. Now he has another case. Chamatz biyamin, v'nasan bismol. Notice before he put it into the kli, he passed the kometz from his right hand to the left hand, so that if he would now place the kometz into the kli with his left hand, it would be possible. But can he pass it back to his right hand? Did anything terrible happen here to interrupt the flow when he passed it from his right hand to the left hand? If it's not an interruption, then when he passes it back to his right hand and he places it into the kli, then it's considered as if it went miyad into the kli. Kometz kosher v'nosno lepasul v'chzira lekosher v'nosan b'kli. Again, we have a question of interruption. It went from the yad HaKohen to the yad of someone who is pasul, let's say he's a balmum, whatever he might be. And then, before it got into the kli, it was handed back into the hands of the original Kohen. Chacham and poslim. The Chacham say it's pasul. Why? Because the very moment it was nitan bismolo, it was passed on to his left hand. Oh, it was nitan liyad pasul, lifnei nitan bekli. Hareu kekometz shenispazer al ritzvas hazora kodem nesinas hakli, and he can't gather it together because we need to go directly from, or shall we say, into the second kli, miyad HaKohen, without any interruption. Although that's the sheet of the Chachamim, Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Shimon Matir, because that's not the same as nafla l'ritzpah, ava v'nispazer ala ritzpah. Ala ritzpah, that's considered a hefsek. That interrupts the flow. But if on the other hand it went into someone else's hand or his own hand, but the left, then that's just like it's being held on a temporary basis, and then it goes back into the hand of the Kohen. And therefore the mincha is ksheira. So let's make a note of where we got up to here. We're about to complete this Amud Yudalid here. We just have one more paragraph, but we'll fill that in Mir Shem.